Book 1 In My Beginning. Chapter 1 Spring of what seems so long ago. Growing up in boarding schools develops in a person a unique perspective on life's goals and options, as well as a somewhat distorted perspective of what friends and family mean to you. The experience varies for the people I've met and those I grew to know. From my perspective and in my environment, the people I observed always began with wealth and most often included the entitlement that goes with being wealthy. Students I met at the boarding schools I attended came from a wide variety of wealthy backgrounds on an international scale. That was a testimony to the school's perceived value in the world and was reflected in the cost our parents or guardians paid to ensure we could take advantage of the opportunities the world was sure to offer graduates of such a fine institution as ours. My own path to exile began earlier than most due to two tragic life-changing events, my mother's death and my father's freedom. I was born Canadian by nationality, but never actually lived in Canada. Prior to my mother's death, we lived in Copenhagen in a very tall industrial-like complex. As I remember, it was nice on the inside, in a museum sort of way, but very cold on the outside. I left that place for the last time at the age of 5 to attend my first boarding school. I never returned to any place I called home after that because after my mother's death, my father took a job in Hong Kong to pay for his true passion. My father was a yachting enthusiast to the extreme. In his early years he competed on the international yachting scene, which is where he took advantage of the connections he made. Working with his yacht moored close enough to spend every waking minute on it was his only plan in life that I was aware of. Whether he had to work or not was debatable. All the money in our family belonged to my mother's estate, and although he kept his yacht and a small annual stipend, it seemed he was surplus to requirements, having served his purpose. My formative years were spent at a very nice school in northern Switzerland, in a town called Schaffhausen, on the German border. The winters were fantastic for all types of sporting events, and those of us who stayed for the summer grew to love the place even more with its rugged terrain and hidden valleys between every hill. Apparently, Schaffhausen had been around for 1,000 years before I got there. I didn't make many long-term friends at that school because students came and went as family fortunes rose and fell. Additionally, the children of the wealthy and privileged or royal and noble tended to be a bit high-strung to say the least, and it was difficult to develop enduring friendships. One friend I did make during those years in Switzerland was Juan Pedro. His family fortunes rose and fell in spectacular fashion by changing the politics of his country. People chanted his father's name in the streets after the revolution, and he was naturally the first president of the new republic. As time passed, he grew more comfortable in his role as an icon for the revolution and the rewards such notoriety made available to him. I think it was about that time Juan arrived at the school, and in fact in the same dormitory as I was in. I liked Juan right from the start because he didn't come from old money. He came from new money. This meant he didn't know how the privileged were supposed to behave. While his family was rapidly gaining experience with the behavior of the privileged, Juan's education of privileged behavior was being deprived. At school, life was orderly, and goals had to be achieved. Eventually Juan's family felt they were more privileged than the rest of the country perceived them to be. A hasty vacation on the family plane found them 5 countries away at a relative's jungle retreat. I said farewell to Juan that weekend. He was whisked away to follow his jungle path through a series of connections and transfers. We could not exchange addresses, but we did exchange a hollow promise to meet up again someday. Preferably after one of us has changed the world, Juan prophesied. During those formative years, my encounters with my father were limited to holidays such as Christmas and intermittent short summer vacations that were always in warm weather climates, near the water. The port would have lots of nightlife and plenty of yachts around. That may sound like a lot of fun, but for someone of my age there was no nightlife and not a lot of excitement. Eventually I didn't miss going on holiday with my father at all. My father's indifference and my mother's bequest allowed me to choose my own educational options as I grew older, as long as I achieved the targets and goals of their expectations, should anyone bother to check. Therefore, when I was old enough, I made my way to Ridgeway School in Scotland. The location placed it well among the esteemed Scottish institutions of higher learning, as well as a great base for adventure and escape. That is where I met my lifelong friends. It seems I owe my Uncle David, on my mother's side, a thank you for the opportunity to enter Ridgeway. The question of entry into Ridgeway was not the funds required. The screening of the candidates for both their academic achievements and, more importantly, for what their name could do for the school was far more critical. The right reference was the best offense. Whatever influence Uncle David wielded seemed to be enough to get me in the door. Whatever that influence was, it served me well as it gave me the opportunity to meet the friends I made in the years to come. Others in my sphere of influence had more specific demands made upon them than I did. One of my best friends at Ridgeway was Ian. He was actually some level of English nobility that had the option to grow into something much more depending on family health and welfare. At this point, due to his position within the family, his options pointed to medicine or diplomatic channels. Ian would be a star at either, however he was doing his best to point his path towards medicine. Many people claim to be interested in benefiting all of mankind, but very few put any effort into it and probably don't have much to offer anyway. Ian was the exception. Ian had the look that the German-bred British royals all had. His blonde hair and blue eyes also came with a bit of a sour look. Most of his family had this trait, and I always thought when I saw them in pictures that they must be smelling something the others weren't. Ian would say his oldest sister Anne could turn milk sour just by looking at it. Throw in a couple Habsburg chins, the odd glacial forehead and such an abundant enough supply of teeth to make Rocky the squirrel envious. That was Ian's family portrait. He led our group study sessions. They usually just included the night before the exam and a great set of condensed notes. His attitude was, everyone gets over the fence and no man is left behind. That was his position on all team events, and that's what motivated us to be prepared. More than anything else we were prepared because nobody wanted to let Ian down. We were all reasonably smart people, so achieving the milestones of this academic world weren't really a serious challenge. Ian's mind was more than just a memory bank of data, and he was always thinking on at least the next level. You might call him a forward thinker. He knew what he wanted to do in life and planned to get there as fast as he could so the real work could begin. Although he was christened as a Protestant, he was not religious at all. In fact, he had a distaste for all religions that accumulated the wealth of their subjects to buy golden trinkets. That could be the definition of royalty also, but not here. His younger brother Richard was less respected by the group. Although he was a student at the school, he was not in our age group for assignments or even excursions. Richard did, however, make his presence known from time to time because he shared a room with Ian. It seemed Richard's options in the family succession plan were directed toward the clergy, and that suited him just fine. He was the definitive rat bastard of the school, turning anyone in for any crime as long as it moved him a step closer to his goals. Languages were Richard's forte, especially dead languages, because these held the secrets to many great treasures of knowledge as well as wealth. He regretted being a Protestant rather than a Catholic because the Catholics had infinitely more ancient texts with more ancient secrets. Also, as a Protestant he couldn't be Pope. Richard was not the type of person you would want to have witness any of your indiscretions because his silence would not come cheaply. I can't imagine anyone crazy enough to confide anything to him, but he had his devious ways. You couldn't take the good without the bad because for those of us who were generally left to our own devices on special occasions such as Christmas, Easter, and summer vacations, it was important to stay on their good side. An invitation to one of their estates for the summer or Christmas was a hotly contested ticket all year long. Perhaps my closest friend was Gordon Zola. Gordon was the type of friend you usually got into trouble with. He had a mischievous side that always struck a chord with me, and he was also a willing ally when the idea or scheme was mine. But honestly, who in their right mind would name their child after the foulest of all cheeses? In his parents' defense, where Gordon comes from, his name is Corridon Zola, and it only gets changed to Gordon when he's in English-speaking countries. His father, Count Laszlo Zola, inherited the title and money from his family. The family owns a small casino somewhere on the French Riviera, but that's not where they originate from. The Zola roots reach back in Hungarian history. Count Laszlo operates the family casino and manages several independent casinos along the coast. The Count was a security expert with incredible security systems and knowledge of the criminal element, at least on the Riviera. We could have called him Gordy or Gordo or Stinky, but instead I chose Cheesy, and it stuck. Cheesy had an eidetic memory, an ability to recall text and images from memory after just a brief look. He could memorize anything in barely a blink. Test scores were nothing for him to master, and you could almost see him reading documents in his mind looking for the answers during the test. Cheesy taught me that academic final tests were always predictable. They have limited source material and they are going to focus on the big money items. Forget about the low-lying fruit. That's for interim tests. His graduation goal was to go, in disguise, to his father's casino and break the bank by counting cards. The counting skill was easily mastered, but the deception tended to be somewhat more difficult as his father was always paranoid. That was why security was his forte. Cheesy had a darker look about him with shoulder-length raven hair and a swarthy complexion. In fact, that was the look of his entire family, including his sisters. He was just spending time at school collecting awards and diplomas while trying to decide what he wanted to do to keep his life exciting. He assumed he would eventually inherit the family casino because he was the oldest, but his father continued to add to the flock every year or two, diluting the future fortunes. Out of all of us, Cheesy was definitely the thrill-seeker. It was his role to manage our off-campus procurement crew that consisted of a number of local fools and idiots who could procure a wee dram for us or some cobby wobblers or dasky narcos, albeit at grossly inflated prices. Cheesy would then send out the call with a coded message for a group of us to meet in one of our favored remote locations in the woods to consume our ill-gotten booty. We never knew who was going to show up or the route we had to take, but it would always be a challenge to get there in time and past school security. The school had decent security to protect the important children in residence from various incidents, many of which were self-inflicted, but some through terrorism at home. Mr. Halpern ran the school's security, and although not extremely diligent, he was beyond reproach. He worshipped Miss Davis Smythe, the headmistress, so bribing him was out of the question, however tricking him was not. Cheesy loved to trick Mr. Halpern when he was ignoring his job trying to ingratiate himself to a board member or Miss Davis Smythe. The more awkward the result, the better. The security forces of the special students were a slightly different story. As long as you were not involving their charges, they'd turn a blind eye or could be persuaded to turn a blind eye. Roly-poly Prince Albert had a staff of 3 security agents assigned to him. I told Cheesy it was just to guard his chocolate. With this taken into consideration, Cheesy would guide us through the security screen of everyone involved in this particular outing. He made a lot of points with the other residents by occasionally including one of the wealthy heirs or royal offspring who could do him a favor at a later date. They never escaped their security, and the journey could be their first semi-independent move in their entire young lives. For this they were usually grateful to Cheesy, especially if it was a success. There was only one American at the school, Richard Kennedy Wadden III. Of course, we called him Dickwad when we weren't happy with him, but generally just Dick. He was the tallest person in the school, including the staff, and was extremely fit. Every day he would spend as much time on physical fitness as he would on schoolwork, and this gave him an almost chiseled look. Dick loved to embarrass the gym teacher, Mr. Colburn, who was grossly overweight. He would ask Mr. Colburn's advice about nutrition, exercise, or sports in front of the class. My favorite queries were the sports advice questions because Mr. Colburn would allude to the fact that he was really fit and a great athlete back in the day. Pictures, trophies, or awards seemed to have eluded him or been lost in transit when he changed schools, unfortunately. Dick would say, "I tell ya what, that's a shame, Mr. Colburn, I would have really loved to see that. Maybe you could show us how it was done." He was the oldest son of a prominent U.S. political force. His father, the Honorable Dickwad Jr., was the governor of Oregon with aspirations for the White House. Dick's grandfather, the Honorable Dickwad Sr., had been the military chief of staff under an earlier U.S. president from Texas. The big money in the Wadden vaults came from pipelines and Texas oil. That would prove to be important to us all in the future. I never heard Dick talk about religion, and I don't think it played any role in his day, which was split between exercise and study. His body was his temple, and his grandfather was his god. Dick's options were clear. The day he was old enough to go to West Point, he would be on a plane to the States. In the meantime, he was going to treat us like his squad. Any sporting event or fitness challenge we had, he was the team captain. His strategy was always the same: pound them into the ground. I had a lot of other acquaintances at school and most other students knew me, but this was my core group and the people I would come to rely on in the future. The school took us on lots of excursions to the local sites. Edinburgh Old Town was full of steep streets and historic monuments everywhere like Street Giles's Cathedral, Holyrood House Palace, and Edinburgh Castle at the top of the hill. We would have liked to visit the pubs, but unfortunately, they were never on the excursion list. One of Cheesy's favourite places to visit was Arthur's Seat because you could see all of Edinburgh from atop it, and he said it made him feel like he was the king of all he could survey. At Ridgeway there was a young noble we called Viscount Fauntleroy, who was the squeakiest whiner in the world as well as a pompous little turd. He was always frustrated and complained about everything, so his psychiatrist decided that primal screaming would be a good therapy for the young Viscount. Every day he had to scream 7 times, so he would be escorted to the roof above the dining hall by his manservant to give his best screams. One morning Cheesy went up on the roof before his first scream and hid a microphone, then lowered the cable down to me in the dining hall, and I connected it to an amplifier hidden inside one of the large cabinets. People were moving about the building, but many were still just getting up when the little Viscount climbed the stairs to the roof and took up his normal position. He inhaled a great breath that forced out his chest like he was getting a new medal. Then he released his scream with such guttural force that his little body shook with a convulsion, causing him to expel a great deal of gas from his butt. The only thing louder than his whining was the laughter that could be heard throughout the school. Not everything in life is fair. Some born of wealth and opportunity squander those opportunities, while others born into poverty achieve Herculean triumphs. The gravity pendulum is a weight on the end of a cord suspended from a pivot. Without friction, it's at an equilibrium that conveys to most an image of rest, peace, and tranquility. It represents fairness to both sides of any opinion, right down the middle. However, when stimulated with friction, the pendulum will move away from its restful place and be set in motion. Pendulums move from side to side, but are always seeking equilibrium to bring them back to rest and peace once again. Sometimes an opposing friction comes from another source that would prefer to keep the pendulum at rest. Between the two opposing forces, they create a balance both can live with. I endeavor to train myself to look at life from both sides and be objective, but when the pendulums of human well-being start swinging, who's going to help them reach equilibrium again by providing that equal resistance? Who or what will be that force that helps regain equilibrium? With one more year at Ridgeway before university, I knew I had to find the passion that would navigate me through my life. I needed an epiphany.